Hey guys, how you going? This is BillyEatWorld, and today we're going to take a look at probably the best deck type for new players, Warlock. Zoolock is still one of the most popular and competitive decks in the game, and the best part about it is that it's relatively affordable for new players. A lot of people think that Zoolock is an aggro deck, but even though it's got a fairly cheap mana curve, it's actually more about board control. The whole idea is to flood the board with sticky minions which eventually grind your opponent down, and it's surprising how long you can last into the late game. In this video, I'm going to show you guys two versions of this deck, the version that I use and a much cheaper version. The cheap version of this deck is only worth 1420 dust, plus the first wing of Nax, and that's not taking into consideration a lot of the commons in here that you may already have. The main difference between the two versions is a Sea Giant and Loatheb, which definitely help this deck pull off a few more wins into the later game. All in all though, the cheap version is still a good starting point, and you can always add to it later as you unlock the rest of the cards. Now, as you can see, this deck is full of sticky minions like Horned Creepers and Nerubian Eggs, which make it very hard for opponents to completely clear the board. These guys can allow you to slowly swamp the board turn by turn, at which point you can buff them up with cards like Direwolf Alpha and Defender of Argus. And that's the whole idea of this deck, to wreck your opponent's early game with a lot of value minions, so that you can eventually grind them down. And once you've got an opponent down to around 10 to 15 health, you can usually throw out some burst cards like Power, Overwhelming and Doomguard to finish them off. The most important thing though is gaining early board control, so pretty much all of the time you're going to want to play a 1-drop on turn 1. You'll also want to keep cards in your starting hand that directly counter your opponent's class, because if you lose board control, it'll be a lot harder to gain it back. Just remember, the more value you can get out of your minions the better, because Zoolock isn't like Face Hunter, where you can just afford to let your little guys die. Your aim should always be to go for value trades, but above all else make sure that you keep something out on the board so that you can eventually overwhelm your opponent. Now, as far as your win condition goes, well, like I said before, Zoolock is about grinding your opponent down until you can burst him with Doomguard or Power Overwhelming. It doesn't always end up going quite this smoothly, but you'd be surprised how quickly you can turn some games around if you're tapping for cards and making value plays. Also, just remember that big minions might cause you a lot of damage, but they don't effectively deal with a lot of small minions, so sometimes it's just better to play around them to save your little guys. Sometimes even one extra damage can make the difference with this deck, and so many cards like Sea Giant and Argus will get a lot more value if you have a bunch of guys on the field. The problem with this particular type of deck is that it's very vulnerable to AoE, so sometimes you're going to want to save an egg or two for the turn before it comes. Also, you probably don't want to have a bunch of 1/1s out on the board against Warrior or Rogue, because between Whirlwinds and Fan of Knives, this can easily lose you the game. The best way to avoid a loss to AoE is to get used to when certain classes are likely to drop these spells, and try and play around them. This is where Loatheb comes into play in the more expensive deck, because you can play him into a full board and force your opponent to play minions instead of AoE spells. Now, the last point I want to make is on tapping, which is something that you'll want to be doing every single time you have a spare 2 mana. Life total really doesn't matter to a Zoo deck, because as soon as you lose board control, you're going to have a hard time winning anyway. Like I said before, value is really important, and tapping will give you a lot more options when it comes to how you deal with enemy threats. Most decks need minions out on the board at some point to win the game, so as long as you keep the enemy board clear, they'll be too busy dealing with your guys to hit you in the face. All in all though, Zoolock is still one of the best decks in the game, and even though most top ranked players are going for more of a mid-range Zoo builds, cheap Zoo decks like this are still pretty effective. Zoo also requires a lot more skill than something like Face Hunter, and it teaches new players a lot more about value plays than a lot of low curve decks do. To be honest, I'm not even really a Warlock player, and even I can do pretty well with Zoo, and sometimes it's just a nice change from long drawn out control games. And that's why I think it's probably the best deck type for new players, because it's cheap, fun and effective, and it's hard to argue with that. But anyway guys, let me know what you think about this deck in the comment section below, and as always, if you like what you see, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Also, check out the links in the description below if you want to see more of my videos, or if you'd like to support my channel on Patreon. And until next time, see you later, and have a good one.